My name is Dr. Peter Hession. I'm the new Faculty Fellow in Irish History here at Ireland House, Glucksman Ireland House. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this first Glucksman Ireland House event of the academic term 2022-2023. We're here today to mark the launch of a volume entitled The Irish Revolution, A Global History, which is, of course, the sixth publication in the Glucksman Irish Diaspora series published by New York University Press, a series, I think, which we can say is going from strength to strength, as showcased by this highly engaging, innovative, and timely set of essays that are collected here and will be launched today. Before I introduce our moderator and the volume's two distinguished editors, I remind you a little bit about today's format. The session in total will go on for 75 minutes. Our two speakers will talk in total for about 40 minutes. And we will open up to Q&A. The last of those 10 minutes will involve 4 contributors who are joining us here today as well. If you have any questions, please make use of the chat panel. And I should also mention, very importantly, that the book can be purchased online via the link to the NYU Press website, which will also appear in the chat panel. Well, it's a pleasure to introduce the co-editors of today's volume. Fearghal McGarry is Professor of Modern Irish History at Queen's University of Belfast. He's authored and edited several books, including The Rising, Ireland, Easter 1916, Ona Duffy, A Self-Made Hero, and Remembering 1916, The Easter Rising, the Somme and the Politics of Memory in Ireland. Patrick Mannion is a research fellow in Irish history at the University of Edinburgh. He's worked on this AHRC-funded project, A Global History of the Irish Revolution, and he is also the author of a prize-winning book, A Land of Dreams, Ethnicity, Nationalism, and the Irish in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and Maine. I will shortly now hand over to Miriam Nyhan, who will moderate today's event. Miriam is really somebody who needs no introduction to the Irish studies community here at New York University and indeed in New York in a wider sense. She was for many years Associate Director of Glucksman Ireland House, as well as a historian, an author, a teacher, archive curator, a podcast host, and much more besides. But importantly, in the context of today's event, she is a co-editor with Professor Kevin Kenny of the Glucksman Irish Diaspora series. And in that guise, it's really a pleasure to hand over proceedings to her at this point now.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome to this wonderful NYU community. I was just thinking today, I was in your shoes about 14 years ago, and all I can say is that I hope that if you have half of the amount of enjoyment and intellectual stimulation and community, derive so much pleasure from the community that I did, you'll have an absolutely great time, and your scholarship will reflect it. You're already amazing, and I think that this time in New York is going to be so great for us all. So welcome, and it's wonderful to follow in your footsteps today. Thank you for your very generous introduction. As Peter mentioned, I'm a contributor to today's volume, so I feel a little bit weird saying all these wonderful things, and I have that weird Irish thing of saying about my own chapter, but you'll take that in the spirit in which it is meant. I want to commend Fearghal and Patrick for such a wonderful contribution to the historiography and a collection of essays that we, one of those collections I think we didn't realize we needed until it's here in front of us. And oh my goodness, I'm so enjoying learning so much from all these wonderful contributions. And I'm really delighted to be engaged in conversation with you both today from Belfast, where they both are there. They look very chummy there together. It looks great. I also would just like to reiterate the Glucksman Irish Diaspora series is the brainchild of the director of Glucksman Ireland House, Professor Kevin Kenny. Kevin's scholarship is invoked throughout this volume. His contribution to how we study diaspora, not to mention Irish diaspora, is so pivotal, and the synergies in terms of us celebrating this launch are just all over the place today. I think Kevin is online here, and I just want to extend my congratulations and kudos to Kevin in that regard. And The series editor, sorry, the editor in NYU Press is a wonderful person called Clara Platter. If you've been to any of our other launches or the inauguration of the series, you'll be familiar with Clara, and she does such great work in terms of translating the words and the contributions so well put together by Fearghal and Patrick onto the page in the lovely volume that we see today. So kudos and thank you to Clara for your commitment and vision with this wonderful series. I'll shut up now and I'm going to hand over to Fearghal, who is going to give us an introduction to what this wonderful volume is doing and sets out to achieve. And Fearghal will then hand over to Patrick before we come together for a little bit of conversation. And then we'll hear from some of our wonderful contributors, fellow contributors who are here with us today as well. So Fearghal, over to you.
Great, thanks Miriam, and thanks Peter, and to all the team there who have organised the launch for today. And I sort of endorse everything you were saying about Glucksman House Ireland and this series in particular. It's a great fit, I think, for this book. So Patrick's going to introduce the book in a few minutes. So I'd just like to say a few words about the wider project it emerges from, and also acknowledge the people who made that project possible. So it was about 5 years ago, around now actually, that Professor Enda Delaney and myself began working on a global history of Irish Revolution 1916 to 1923, which was generously funded by the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council. And the project was based at Queen's University Belfast and at the University of Edinburgh, and was supported by Professor Rob Savage at Boston College's Irish Studies programme. And our goal essentially was to develop a global history of the Irish Revolution. The key methodology was to apply a transnational approach to investigate how interactions across national boundaries shaped the struggle for independence. And essentially we wanted to integrate two sophisticated but largely separate historiographies centering on the Irish Revolution and on the Irish diaspora to develop a more inclusive model for analysing what we really wanted to bring out, which was the global character of Irish nationalist activism during the revolution. And the project centered on two fairly basic research questions, at least at the outset, which was how did global factors shape the revolution within Ireland? And how did revolutionary events in Ireland impact beyond the island? And in terms of international factors, we had in mind how the breakup of European empires, the rise of Wilsonian self-determination, and the opportunities provided by the Paris Peace Conference galvanized nationalist movements across the post-war world. In terms of responses to the revolution beyond the island, we were thinking of the Irish diaspora, but also reactions within the empire, both of the white dominions are quite important towards the end of the Irish Revolution, but also anti-colonial movements, and that became a more important aspect of the project than we initially envisaged. But both research strands of the project, whether the inward or outward facing strands, addressed the same question. To what extent should revolutionary change be understood within a global and transnational as well as a nation state framework? Much of the research was carried out by three very talented postdoctoral fellows, Dr. Dara Gannon, Dr. Brian Hanley, and Patrick, and each of them designed their own projects to address the research themes. We also developed scholarly networks involving early career researchers and more established scholars, and organized a program of workshops, conferences, and public engagement. Key publications that have emerged from the project include a special issue of Irish Historical Studies, which came out in 2020, a History Ireland supplement published in 2019, and Ireland 1922, Independence, Partition, Civil War, which was published by the Royal Irish Academy earlier this year. We also worked with Boston College's Mike Cronin and Mark Duncan to develop content for a global revolution strand on Century Ireland, Century Ireland website. And the last time I checked there were over 40 essays hosted on that website, spanning really much of the world. So the book that we're launching today, The Irish Revolution, A Global History, is the culmination of a more extensive body of research to which well over 100 scholars from around the world have contributed. And I want to sort of take the opportunity today to acknowledge the collaborative nature of the project and all of those who contributed in different ways. And we were always conscious in embarking on this project that given its scope and scale, a global history of Irish Revolution, that it would require a collaborative approach. And we were also aware that many other scholars were and had in the past applied transnational and comparative and global methodologies. In particular, the work of Nyhan, who's a fellow contributor to the Glucksman Irish Diaspora series, whose book Transnational Perspectives in Irish History very much influenced my approach in terms of this project. And one of our project's aims was to provide a platform to raise the profile of global approaches and to stimulate a body of work that would demonstrate the value of transnational, global and comparative approaches for addressing maybe not every research question about the Irish Revolution, but certainly some of them. So I just want to conclude before I hand over to Patrick by identifying some of the key themes that emerged from this project. And I think all of these themes are explored by the brilliant contributors to this book. And I'm in the same position as Miriam, and find it difficult to sing the praises of the book because I'm in it, but there really are some stellar contributions that we're thrilled to have in. So, and so the kind of themes which emerge and which will probably come out in our conversation as well are the importance of looking across rather than simply back in time. So, for example, for the revolution, we have this extensive historiography on Easter 1916, but the mass radicalization of the immediate post-war period, so thinking of things like the anti-conscription crisis of 1918 or the general election, we still don't have general histories of those events, whereas I think that's a hugely important era in terms of the revolution. The importance of how we conceptualize space, and by we I mean historians, how we think about space in our work. And so in the project and in the book, we trace how power is contested across a wide variety of spaces, such as Paris and New York, and indeed how the relative importance of these spaces shifts over time in response to particular developments. We also emphasize the value of considering Irish revolutionary experiences in a variety of comparative contexts. And again, these shift over time. During the 1918 election, for example, Republicans really strongly emphasized parallels in terms of Irish demands at that time and the successor states in Central and Eastern Europe, which had essentially were receiving their independence. Then with the failure to win entry to the Paris Peace Conference, links with anti-colonial movements much further afield become more relevant in many respects, particularly in places like America, where a lot of the propaganda war centers. By emphasizing the Republican campaign as an international propaganda struggle more than as a military conflict rooted in Ireland, I think global approaches place greater emphasis on political ideas and also political ideals, including the role of suffragists, labor activists, and other radicals as transnational connectors, linking the struggle for independence in Ireland with the movement abroad. So I think exploring the Irish Revolution beyond Ireland shifts our perspective with some themes that are less central at home, such as race or anti-colonialism or empire, assuming much greater importance beyond Irish borders in very different political contexts. Making sense of revolutionary change in Ireland, we would argue, requires an understanding not just of the revolution in Ireland, but also of how the wider post-war world was changing and the consciousness of Irish Republicans at home and abroad in terms of those changes that were taking place and their importance in terms of making particular outcomes possible. So at this point, I'll hand over to Patrick, who's going to introduce the book itself.
Perfect, thanks, Fearghal. So you mentioned the AHRC project, and I came on board and joined the project back in May 2019, when the world was a very different place and in many ways. And I was actually working with Enda Delaney at the University of Edinburgh. Now, even before I joined the project, the preliminary plans that would eventually lead to the book, they were already well underway. Like so many edited collections, this one began as a planned symposium, a gathering of scholars that was being planned in collaboration with Professor Rob Savage at the Center for Irish Programs at Boston College. So one of the outcomes was to bring leading scholars of the transnational Irish Revolution, based in both Europe and North America, to Boston College, Chestnut Hill, to present latest research, exchange ideas about the direction or directions of global or transnational approaches to the Irish Revolution. So the symposium was scheduled for, I believe it was April 2020 was the original plan. But as you can all imagine, the pandemic ensured that our plans got derailed. The conference was postponed initially. I think we entertained the idea of a virtual setup like we're doing today, but back then in the spring of 2020, the capability to use Zoom for this sort of thing, it was really in its infancy. So we postponed the symposium. I believe we attempted to reschedule it twice, later in 2020 and early 2021, but successive waves of COVID ultimately meant that bringing together a dispersed group of international scholars just wasn't feasible. It never happened. But the fact remained, we had approached an impressive range of contributors, most of whom by this stage were already well into researching and writing their contributions. So even though the in-person symposium had to be canceled, it was a fairly straightforward decision to press ahead with the book project that we always envisaged would grow out of the symposium. So Dara Gannon was co-editing the book on 1922, which was another one of our outputs. So we decided that Fearghal and myself would take on the task as lead editors of this publication, which would eventually become The Irish Revolution, A Global History. We still had to find a publisher, of course, but all of us on the project had really good relationships with Kevin Kenny. I myself did a postdoc with Kevin back at Boston College before he moved down to New York and I moved over to Edinburgh. And we talked about these essays we were developing when Kevin visited Edinburgh back, I think that was in January 2020. He mentioned the Glucksman Irish Diaspora series. So we knew that Kevin and Miriam, everyone at NYU Press would be receptive to a submission. So the chapters came in as we expected. They were of exceptional quality. There was very little real editing that we had to do on the individual chapters. They were great. I think the hardest part was imposing a coherent organizational structure on what are these strikingly distinctive chapters and approaches. But I think we found enough commonalities between them that the order and sub-themes we ultimately chose gives us, I think, an accessible and readable publication that flows quite well from one chapter to the next. So the idea, of course, is that the published volume presents a range of transnational approaches or methodologies, and Fearghal touched on this as well. That's going to expose readers not just to the utility, but to the sheer breadth of research that is out there on the global Irish Revolution. There's a plethora of approaches within this book. We've got comparative studies that examine the Irish Revolution alongside contemporary cases, studies of how overseas nationalist and radical movements influenced revolutionaries in Ireland, how the Irish Revolution conversely was perceived in other settings and influenced radicals, revolutionaries elsewhere, transnational biographies of key figures. Several of our chapters are biographical in scope, which I think is a nice commonality between some of these. Studies of how the intergenerational diaspora actively engaged with Ireland's struggle for independence, and many other sub-themes and methodologies even within those. And I think just one final point I want to make before we hand back to Miriam is in putting together this body of scholarship, it's really not our intention to put forward these global, transnational, comparative, diasporic modes of understanding the Irish Revolution as necessarily the best way or ways of understanding the time period. We're not trying to say that transnational methodologies are, in any way superior or lead to a clearer interpretation of Ireland's past than, the incredibly detailed local studies which had been a primary feature of the historiography for some time. Neither are we saying that this is entirely new. Transnational interpretations of the Revolutionary era, I mean, they go back to the 1930s and 40s with studies of Irish American nationalism, Clan na Gael, and so on. What we're going for with this volume, I think, is just trying to add to a critical mass of scholarship, providing a taste of the vast range of topics and methodologies that are out there when we cast our gaze beyond Ireland in looking at that post-war period. So through the individual chapters, the individual case studies, I hope that readers will see that the revolution was inherently transnational in many ways. And there's a great deal to be learned from a closer examination of some of these global trends. So I think as an introduction, that's probably all we have. So we'll go back to Miriam now, who will throw some questions at us.
That's great. Thank you, Patrick and Fearghal. I think you did a great job there in terms of setting things out a little bit, and I really appreciate. I don't know if some of the other contributors feel the way I did about being asked to contribute to the volume. Pat, off your last comment there in particular, like for me, I had this like niggling thing of Marcus Garvey and the intersections of, you know, how he identified as someone of the British Empire, how that was coming together in terms of his experience as an immigrant in the United States and diasporic identities, and then the whole issue as he was grappling with it in real time around race and how that fit into all this. So I don't know whether some of the other contributors feel the way I did in terms of just you giving us an opportunity to kind of go down those rabbit holes and bring all those themes together in interesting ways and in different ways. That's the way I approached mine. And I commend you. And I was looking at the structure of it. That wasn't easy to do in terms of how you thematically brought things together, because they really kind of straddle a lot of them. But I think you did a great job in putting some coherence on them in terms of making it a little bit easier for the reader to go from one to the other. The whole notion of the Wilsonian moment is important to understanding the approach taken in the collection. For those tuning in today who don't really know what that kind of means in the context of what we're talking about today, would one or other of you give us an overview about what that actually meant in terms of the backdrop to the volume?
Yeah, sure. Well, in his very famous 14-point speech, which I think might have been early 1918, it's certainly well before the war has ended, President Wilson reframes the Allied war aims somewhat unilaterally. I think Britain and France were very keen on this reframing, but among the kind of the principles that he says that the First World War is about is the principle of the national right to self-determination. Even though he actually never uses that phrase, he talks about self-determination. And Wilson is thinking specifically of some of the territories, not even all of them, but just some of the territories within the defeated empires, Poland, for example, that these suppressed nations should be given their independence as an objective of the war. But Wilson certainly wasn't thinking of Ireland, and he certainly wasn't thinking of non-white colonized people. So there's quite a hierarchical notion of who deserves independence, but there's also a practical notion. I mean, basically, Wilson sees his job as, well, we have to draw new boundaries within the defeated empires. It's not our job to draw new boundaries around the entire world. It's kind of some sympathy for him from that point of view. But I think what the Wilsonian moment does, what this speech does, and how it's received, is it sort of, it takes the genie out of the bottle. The Wilsonian moment comes to mark a global shift in the way political power is conceptualized, and it's greeted really rapturously across much of Europe, and I think maybe not necessarily naively by Irish Republicans. I think a lot of them realize that, well, we're not actually likely to just get independence given to us as Paris Peace Conference, but Wilsonianism opens the door to saying, look, our political case really has kind of a legitimacy. And there's a famous letter from Robert Lansing, the US Secretary of State, who writes that, I think he writes this while he's traveling over to Paris to Wilson. He writes that America's embrace of self-determination is loaded with dynamite. It's a great phrase, because of the hopes that it would raise for the Irish, the Indians, and the Egyptians. And it's really interesting that he puts those three groups together, because you do find that those three groups are mentioned together a lot throughout this period, and well into 1920 as well. So essentially, I think the Wilsonian moment is a kind of a shorthand for the breakup of empires, that political reality, the Wilsonian vision, and it can be flawed in lots of ways, but nonetheless it's a very radical vision in certain respects. The idea of a kind of equal community of nations being the way the world should be ordered, and also the mass democratization which is happening at the grassroots, particularly again thinking about Central and Eastern Europe. They weren't just being given independence; they were taking it with the collapse of empires. And I think all of these together serve to sort of delegitimize imperialism as a method of government. I mean, like, crucially, they don't necessarily destroy imperialism. Empires continue to exist, Britain most obviously, but it's very difficult to make the argument for empire in this post-war period. Even Britain and France, whose empires actually expand in the wake of the First World War into the Middle East, for example, ostensibly accept, and I'm quoting one of their kind of declarations here, that post-war governments must derive authority from the initiative and free choice of the indigenous population. So what does this mean in Ireland? What does this mean in India? So I think the Wilsonian Moment, and again, it's a great book by Erez Manela, which explores this across 5 different Asian countries. And one of the things which really struck me reading that book is how well the model applies to what happens in parts of Europe and Ireland. Manela argues that this Wilsonian moment fuels the rise of more assertive nationalisms who quote Wilson in their appeals for independence. I think sometimes quote Wilson quite opportunistically, as the Irish do, as well as sometimes maybe more genuinely. The Wilsonian moment marginalizes accommodationist forms of nationalism. So we think of, for example, the Redmondite imperial project, the idea that you could have a kind of an Irish state which is comfortably part of the British empire, which accepts home rule as the limit of its ambitions. And again, so I think it's Maurice Walsh who talks about, you've got Redmonds and De Valera's all across Europe, and the De Valera's all come to the fore in the wake of the post-war moment. And then, of course, then the failure of the Wilsonian moment, particularly at the Paris Peace Conference, to actually translate into independence for many nations, prompts more radical and more violent forms of resistance. So I think Britain, essentially by 1921, is forced to come to terms with the political reality that of the legitimacy that's attached to self-determination. And I think this causes not like the end of British imperial power, but it causes Britain to sort of reconfigure how it exercises imperial power in places like Ireland. So we've got a new language of mandates and free states, and we have partition and so on, which could be almost seen as a kind of Empire 2.0. How do you reconfigure imperial authority to give some appearance of a relationship with democracy in local regions?
That's great, Fearghal. Thanks for kind of setting that stall out a little bit. I just didn't want to assume that everyone, there are specialists here who will be very familiar with it, and more or less so. It's great to see this kind of, I think you've mainstreamed this, Manela, more than we had maybe until recently. To you again, Fearghal, and then we'll go to Patrick. If I could ask you about your contribution, you really, take us to the point of like kind of decentering us in terms of geography. Your fascinating study of Irish and Korean nationalism and the comparisons of their respective uprisings are really reflective of the wider goals, I think, of the volume. Can you, for our viewers today, tell us a little bit about what you unearthed in that research?
Thanks, Miriam. Well, I start off with a comparison of 2 events which are iconic for Ireland and Korea. March 1st is the Korean, initially largely peaceful political uprising in 1919, which is violently crushed with enormous fatalities. And then the Easter Rising, which starts off as a violent insurrection, but then becomes a very political kind of movement in the years that follow. And both March 1st and Easter Rising are kind of mythologized as the foundational moments in the national histories of Korea and Ireland. even though interestingly, neither of them leads directly to independence, but in terms of history and memory, they serve as the point of origin. And I only got interested in Korea actually when I was invited to go to Korea in 2019 to speak at the centenary of Korean independence. And it struck me as really interesting that they wanted to hear from someone about Irish history, you know, reflecting on their own kind of centenary. So those connections, I think, even though as becomes clear in the chapter, there isn't actually tangible connections between the movements, but intellectually and politically and ideologically, there's a lot of kind of rich interaction. So I suppose comparative histories, that's essentially what I'm looking at. I'm comparing the Korean and Irish Republican efforts to win independence, center on similarities and differences. So both the Koreans and the Irish declare republics in spring 1919, but both of those republics fare very differently. And one thing which really struck me was the similarities in terms of the methods that both groups of revolutionaries use. They declare independence. In fact, they declare republics. They establish provisional governments, and they're doing this within weeks of each other too, which I think is interesting. This is happening in many other places too. They both send envoys to the Paris Peace Conference. They organize international propaganda campaigns. They, after the failure at Paris, they moved to Washington and set up kind of media bureaus and diplomatic offices to lobby the Senate and Congress. In both cases, the Republican movements mobilized their diasporas. They both float revolutionary bonds in the US. They both send their leading politicians off on presidential trips across the United States, which is a really interesting kind of performance of sovereignty, which I think, so, I mean, one thing which struck me kind of comparing this was, I think accounts of the Irish Revolution sometimes tend to overstate the novelty of how Irish Republicans are going about trying to win independence. I mean, it's a really sophisticated campaign, but they're sort of responding in very similar ways as other Republican revolution movements to this new set of opportunities that the Wilsonian moment presents. I also compared the declarations of independence, and so declarations of independence emerging across the world in 1919, but the Korean and Irish ones, there's kind of two strands. One is emphasizing history and culture and civilization and so on. So that ancient idea of legitimized by history. But in both cases, the declarations of independence, the Korean and Irish ones, really have, I think, what are probably opportunistic references to Wilsonian self-determination, to Wilson's vision of economic liberalism, free trade between free nations, the need for a sort of a free international community to underpin peace and so on. And in a lot of the propaganda in both cases, they're actually quoting Wilson, asking Wilson to support you know, their demands, which really annoys Wilson a lot. He doesn't take kindly to it. The differences are also, I think, interesting. Very contrasting levels of violence and suppression used by Japan and Britain. I think this is in part related to the democratic nature or lack of democratic nature of both states. I think Britain is unusually kind of democratic as a sort of imperial state goes, but it's also, I think, related to susceptibility to international pressure. The UK are, I think, remarkably sensitive to American opinion and also to Dominion opinion. I think that really is important in terms of figuring out why the settlement and the treaty comes about. Another interesting difference was the very different levels of diasporic influence, especially in America, which is really the key kind of you know, battle zone, if you like. I think the Irish in some ways, weirdly, were lucky because of the consequences of the famine, because it created this mass emigration, and it meant that there was this huge, incredibly well-organized Irish population across Northern American cities, politically really well connected, that formed a very effective lobby, particularly within the Democratic Party. And it's interesting when you see Korean efforts to get resolutions passed and so on, you know, they really found it because there just isn't a comparable kind of diasporic community. I think another interesting difference is attitudes of race. I think it really did help the Irish that they were seen as white and European. Even though they do, you know, form linkages with Indians and Egyptians and so on, there are these interesting kind of differences. And then maybe a final difference that really came out is the contrasting influence of the diaspora on domestic politics. So, I mean, the Koreans don't achieve independence until after the Second World War, but when they do, the key presidents and leaders of Korea, a lot of them actually come from America, and they have a very American vision of politics. They're educated in America and so on. So in a sense, a kind of an American idea of republican democracy shapes the Korean state when it finally emerges. Now, obviously, Irish America is hugely important in terms as an influence on Irish republicanism, but for all that influence, Irish Americans don't influence Ireland in the same way. When push comes to shove and there's a breach or conflict between De Valera and Irish Americans from the American leadership, it is the Irish who are much more in control of kind of shaping their destiny. So again, it's just comparisons, I suppose, almost raise counterfactuals, alternative outcomes that you could have seen shaping Irish nationalism in Ireland in different ways.
Yeah, and thanks, Fearghal, and putting into relief that, you know, the demographic impact of that mass exodus from Ireland into the United States, and the fact that in this period that we're looking at, it's not their first outing in terms of organizing and all the social capital and political capital and resources and institutional knowledge and things like that that goes with that. That brings us very nicely. Thank you for that, Fearghal. It's really, really interesting, and we're going back to the United States to pick up some of the threads that you touch on there in terms of the looking at putting Korea and Ireland in a comparative context to Patrick's chapter on the Friends of Irish Freedom, an organization that many people tuning in today will be quite familiar with in terms of the historiography on the Irish American experience. But you're looking at this example in the Panama Canal zone. Patrick, can you tell us a little bit about that chapter and whet people's appetite a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So I think had you told me 5 years ago that I'd be writing an article about the Panama Canal zone, I would have thought that was a very funny idea. But I've been reading for years the mainstream Irish American nationalist newspapers through 1990, 2021. And every now and again, I'd come across these references to the Panama Canal zone and the Friends of Irish Freedom operating there, making financial contributions towards Irish independence, contributions rolling in from as far away as the Canal zone in Panama. And for those who don't know, the Canal zone was American territory in Panama. So I think 10 miles, stretched 10 miles from either side of the Panama Canal, which was American territory. And in practice, really what it was in a lot of ways was essentially a reproduction of the segregated Jim Crow American South. Its inhabitants were a mix of generally middle-class white American engineers and canal administrators, quite a few of whom were of Irish extraction, alongside a predominantly Black West Indian laborers and canal workers who were grossly underpaid, overworked, and poorly housed. So, essentially this becomes a racialized colonial American enclave. And it's within this context that three branches of the Friends of Irish Freedom are established. And the Friends of Irish Freedom, of course, were at this point America's foremost Irish Republican fundraising and lobbying group, with hundreds of branches right across the country. So my study basically covers three themes, looking at these branches. So first of all, Fearghal talked in his introduction about the importance of space and looking across space. Well, I'm really looking at the extension of Irish American political networks to the diasporic periphery. So the transfer of ideas, people, money, literature from centers of Irish American nationalism, which was predominantly the big cities, New York especially, Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, to a periphery in the Canal Zone, where it was consumed by Americans of Irish descent. Alongside that, I look at the opposition, and this is a bit more unique to the Canal Zone, the opposition to the Friends of Irish Freedom by the small delegation of British diplomats who were stationed in the Panamanian Republic. They were quite displeased that that the Friends of Irish Freedom were active in the Canal Zone, and they sent extensive reports on their activities, and actually tried very hard to disrupt, meetings and rallies, and to stop those from happening. The British opposition to the Friends of Irish Freedom in the Canal Zone. And then what I want to bring out, I think, ultimately with this study is the uncomfortable irony of these very comfortable Irish Americans passing resolutions opposing imperialism and imposing empire at the exact same time that they themselves are, essentially actively involved in opposing West Indian labor activism by the workers in the zone. There's as I say, sort of an uncomfortable but also fascinating irony in there that definitely tells us something about I think about Irish American nationalism and Irish diasporic nationalism more broadly. So that's what my study is about.
Thanks, Patrick. So much great stuff there. I suppose I'm watching the time a little bit, but we're okay. I think of time for a few questions with the two of you before maybe we bring in some of our contributors. I'm wondering, I think you've pondered why activists or people who were inspired by anti-imperialist ideals, who had no Irish connection at all, or no connections to Ireland, or no linguistic connections or cultural or whatever. Why do you think, Patrick and Fearghal, they were attracted to the Irish independence struggle as either a model or the kind of synergies, I suppose, or kind of comparative dimensions, Fearghal, that you touch on there in the Korean example? What is it about? Is it the positioning of Ireland vis-a-vis these two great powers, the US and the UK, the linguistic issues, those kinds of things? Can you just elucidate that a little bit for us?
Do you want to take this one?
Yeah. Sure. I mean, I think Ireland often received more than its fair share of attention. I mean, if you look at the extraordinary coverage of Easter 1916, particularly in America on the New York Times, I think for 3 weeks running, even though like quite a small deal militarily in terms of fatalities, I think a lot of it is about Ireland's status as part of the UK, within the UK, its proximity to London. It's a very easy story to cover compared to, for example, what's happening in India. When the Black and Tans commit their first reprisal, I think it's in Balbriggan, that's in the British and international newspapers the next day. It takes months for accounts of what the British are doing in places like Mesopotamia and India to come out. I think race is part of it. I think people are small-scale violence in Ireland is covered much more critically than much worse things that are happening in other parts of the empire. Although you could make a case, Maurice Walsh does, that the uncomfortableness about Ireland for Britain is that it exposes the workings of imperialism in a way which isn't kind of as visible in more far-flung parts of the world. Keith Jeffrey identified as one, potential limitation of some diasporic approaches, that it can become a kind of ethnic train spotting. You're just looking at Irish people around the world and what they're doing. And he has the suggestion that it's useful to separate Irish people, a very interesting area of research, from the Irish question. And I think our book does that to a certain extent. The Irish question is really debated across the world, particularly in 1919, 1920, across the Irish world, across the British world, and beyond in other empires. And I think one reason for this, and it's explored by some great essays in the book, looking at Algeria and Russia, is I think revolutionaries always look for models to legitimize or advance their causes. So we think about Arthur Griffith, for example, looking to the Boer War or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And in the same way, other movements look to Ireland as a high-profile example of a successful anti-imperial movement. So Indians, Egyptians, Black rights activists, as your essay on Marcus Garvey and David Brundage's essay on Du Bois. So basically, you're searching around for a model to prove that your revolutionary movement can be successful, or how to improve it. And Ireland is just very, very visible, just fleetingly in that post-war moment as maybe the best organized, or one of the best organized international movements for anti-imperialism and symbolic of kind of wider freedoms also in suffrage and labor circles.
Fearghal, you referenced there actually the Algerian study, and that might be a good opportunity because we can come back to some questions between the three of us if we're stuck. I don't think we will be. Happily, we have four of the other contributors here today, and Donal Hassett is with us, who's based in UCC in Cork. And I'm wondering, Donal, would you unmask yourself there and talk to us a little bit about your fascinating chapter, just referenced there by Fearghal. I think you're here with us, so please feel
I am, yeah.
Great, thank you, Donal.
Thanks, Miriam, and thanks to the organisers. I was really honoured to be asked to contribute to this book, as primarily, obviously you can tell I'm from Ireland, but I'm primarily a historian of colonialism in North Africa. So it was really interesting for me to get to engage with the history of Ireland, looking from the perspective of Algeria. So in my chapter, I tried to study how Algerian nationalists engaged with, reimagined and evoked the Irish Revolution throughout the 20th century. And it begins by looking at the period of the Irish Revolution itself. So how political figures in Algeria in the 1910s and the 1920s talked about Ireland. And firstly, that kind of shows us that, as Fearghal and Patrick have been saying, the Irish Revolution or the Irish question was a topic of public discussion all over the world, and that it was written about widely in the Francophone press, but also in the Arabic press, which was circulated clandestinely among Algerian nationalists. And what we see in this period of the 1920s is initially Algerian nationalists or proto-nationalists evoke Ireland as a cautionary tale. So they say to the French colonial authorities, if you don't reform, if you don't give us more rights, we'll end up like Ireland. And France is not an empire like the British. It's an empire based on equality and rights. You know, they're appealing to the French imperial rhetoric. But if you continue to behave like the British, you'll have the same result as the British. So that's quite interesting. And it seems, it speaks to the fact that the Irish Revolution is, you know, really polysemous, can be used to mean lots and lots of different things. That proves ineffective. And then we have another mobilization of the Irish Revolution in the 1920s, which evokes the revolution as this moment of romantic nationalism. So something that Algerians and North Africans in general can learn from, can be inspired by. And that's most notably the case in a text which I studied, which is called Nidal Irlanda, or Ireland's Struggle, written by an Algerian intellectual, Ahmed Poufik al-Madani, who is based in Tunisia. It's a really fascinating text because it shows how he understood the Irish Revolution. It's very long, detailed about geography and history of Ireland, and in it you get all these claims about Irish history that we might not recognise as Irish historians, but ones that speak to his politics. And in it, we see him, for example, talking about Terence MacSwiney as a mujahid, which is the term used later during the War of Independence to describe the heroes, the martyrs of the Algerian Revolution. So that text is about how a small nation, which is integrated into the imperial metropole, so that's the case of Algeria, a settler colony, which, at least in the Algerian interpretation of Ireland, describes Ireland and Algeria, how it secured its freedom. So it's a message of hope for the people of Algeria. By the time we get to the 1940s and 50s, Ireland's role in Algerian nationalist imaginary has shifted, and it's much more about seeing what people can practically learn from the Irish precedent. And so you have this incredible moment in the 1940s where Hossein Ahmed, one of the leading rising figures of the nationalist movement, describes this clandestine congress in Algiers and says, and I quote, "We may as well have been in a bar in Dublin. Such was the atmosphere of patriotic conspiracy." So we can see this reference to Ireland really strong. And what Hossein Ahmed argues in his strategic texts is that the Algerians can learn from the Irish movement's ability to combine politics with armed struggle. So he suggests that they go to parliament in France and that they adopt policies that we associate with the Home Rule movement. particularly the Parnell Home movement, so filibustering, etc. So that's really interesting. That again proves to be stymied by the fact that Algeria is a far more coercive and racially discriminatory colonial system than Ireland was even in the 1920s. So when the Algerians tried to effect change through armed struggle and the ballot box, the French stuffed the ballot boxes. So the democratic kind of movement is not an option. And then the final phase, which I was interested in, is in the kind of dying stages of colonialism in Algeria, where Ireland features again as a cautionary tale, but more for the nationalist movement itself. So you have one of the iconic figures of the nationalist movement, Laderbi Ben Mehidi. So anyone who's seen the film, The Battle of Algiers, he has a kind of a starring role in it. He's kidnapped off and murdered by the French. And he, in this kind of copy of a book about Irish history, makes notes on it in which he describes the Free State or Cumann na nGaedheal as traitors, and he warns against selling out the revolution. And that crops up again for a final time during the negotiations with the French, where the prospect of partition, which the French are hoping to partition Algeria, is evoked, and the president of Ireland is then thrown in their face by the Algerians, saying that it's not a sustainable solution. So these are just some of the examples in which Algerian nationalist figures mobilize Irish history, often in ways that we might be surprised by or mightn't expect. And of course, the chapter finishes with something I think which is really interesting, which is the kind of the return of the boomerang, when during the Troubles we see this evocation of Algeria in the north by both Unionists and by Republicans. So we can see that the imagined geographies of empire persist and shift over time, will play a role in revolutionary movements. So thank you.
Thanks, Donal. That's fascinating stuff, and that kind of portability, you know, as you say, the imaginary component of the portability and malleability of all these things are so nicely drawn out in your chapter. Thank you for being on today, and you're organising an event, I know, in the next couple of weeks in Ireland, which will explore some of these themes, I think, in a little bit more, with a bit more time as well. So do watch out for that. From Donal, then I'd invite Dara Gannon is with us, I believe, as well, from UCD. Dara, I think I saw you there, and welcome, Dara. If you wouldn't mind sharing with our viewers today a little bit about your wonderful intervention in this collection as well.
Thank you very much, Miriam. It's great to be back on Glucksman Ireland time, as they say, and to see so many friends and familiar faces. And really, I would extend again my thanks and congratulations to Fearghal and Patrick on bringing together so many diverse histories and expert scholars from around the world, as Patrick mentioned, at the height of the COVID pandemic. So it really is a testament to your experience as editors and expertise in the field as well. And it's really a volume for the ages, and I'm sure will be read and reviewed in those terms for many years to come. So to answer Miriam's question, the chapter which I contributed was entitled Inventing Global Ireland, the Idea and Influence of the Irish Race Convention. And I was really looking at, basically there were a series of Irish race conventions, so-called, between 1916 and 1922, which were ostensibly organized at a local or national level, from the United States to Australia, Argentina, and later on in Paris. And these have been explored in previous histories in terms of local historiography or national historiographies. So they'd be featured in histories of the Irish in Australia, but not necessarily in transnational terms. And I was really struck by the timing, the synchronicity almost of these events, and how closely organized they were together, almost coordinated. And Miriam, of course, invoked the name of Kevin Kenny earlier, and I'd like to speak to that, because Kevin's work, of course, is so influential in our field, but more specifically, he has argued in a very influential essay 20 years ago about the importance of looking at nationalism, not only in an ethnic, but an international or diasporic sense, and to look at the development of diasporic sensibilities alongside ethnic identities, that this is an area very fruitful and rich, potentially rich for comparative inquiry. So it's really following in that sense of that new agenda that Kevin had set in that influential article. So I was asking a series of questions of these race conventions and looking at them collectively, I was asking, for example, where was the idea of the Irish Race Convention politically conceived? How did nationalists around the world negotiate those very different and sometimes divergent ethnic tensions underlying this kind of all-encompassing term? And thirdly, what transnational influence ultimately did this idea of the Irish Race Convention exert during the Irish Revolution? So just to kind of plot the coordinates of these conventions, in 1916, an Irish Race Convention in New York, just 6 weeks before the Easter Rising. In 1919, an Irish Race Convention in Philadelphia. In the autumn of 1919, a race convention in Melbourne. In the summer of 1921, the Irish Race Convention in Buenos Aires. And in January 1922, the Irish Race Congress in Paris. Now, what's quite interesting when you explore these ostensibly national events is that they're actually very closely interlinked. And I've argued in the essay that we can look at the Irish Race Convention, this term, as a formula used by Irish nationalists around the world to invoke political influence at strategic times, and also to ostensibly establish a kind of global brand or global identity of Irish nationalism. And this invoked, let's say, a power which was far in excess of the actual power of Irish nationalists in their respective countries. And so, for example, in the Irish Race Convention in Philadelphia in 1919, which was ostensibly an Irish-American event attended by the leaders of the Friends of Irish Freedom and others, they send a cablegram to Archbishop Daniel Mannix in Melbourne, encouraging the Irish in Australia to similarly organise a race convention. And Mannix obliges, setting up a race convention that autumn. So there is this kind of sense of a transnational network being established, and they use this kind of totemic brand of the Irish Race Convention to suggest this transnational network. So it's an element of brand nationalism, so to speak. So ultimately, I argue in this chapter that the idea of the Irish Race Convention becomes this totemic representation of Irish nationalist influence around the world. Irish nationalists around the world in different countries sought to construct and mobilize a global diasporic identity using this term, Irish Race Convention, which again, far outweighed their own national organizations. And these networks were in fact mobilized and influenced as much by transnational diasporic identities. Fearghal mentioned, for example, the issue of race, for instance, as they were Irish island influences. I think it's also important to mention that the Irish Race Conventions were very often created or convened at important strategic moments to ostensibly offer a degree of political influence, certainly at the international level. And the best example of that is the Irish Race Congress, which took place in Paris in January 1922, which is really a remarkable event, kind of lost in the annals of Irish history itself. This was created originally by the Irish nationalists in South Africa, and it was attended by 100 delegates from 22 countries between the 21st and 28th of January 1922. Now, it's gone down in the Irish history books, that the Irish island history books, of course, as one of the kind of fatalities of the division caused by the Anglo-Irish Treaty. But its organizers sought to use the idea of the Irish Race Congress to try and influence the ongoing treaty negotiations in London in the autumn of 1921. The Congress was originated in the spring of 1921. And Fearghal interestingly mentioned this idea of a shift in our focus away from Irish island politics to, Greater Ireland politics or Greater Ireland histories. And I think that's very apropos here. If you focus in on the island between 1919 and 1922, violence becomes a focal point of analysis, of discussion, and of narrative. But if you move away from the island, diplomacy, propaganda, publicity become the foci. And this is where the Irish diaspora had the strongest card. And so you see the idea in the spring of 1921 in South Africa originally, and then around the Irish world, Irish nationalists are going to organize this race congress in Paris in January 1922 at the height of the treaty negotiations, ultimately, to try and play this diaspora card in the negotiations. And I'll just leave you with one question. It's very often asked why De Valera did not go to London. Very rarely asked, and I think one of the great missed opportunities, why a diaspora delegate was not part of the treaty negotiating team in London. And I think that's something that Irish nationalists around the world said in Paris as one of the great missed opportunities. So I'll leave it there, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you this evening.
Thank you, Dara. It's a great chapter and building on so much of the wonderful work you've been doing in recent years. Thank you for being here, and for it's wonderful to hear it from you directly in terms of your great chapter. I'm going to call on Heather Jones next. Heather's work brings in, we kind of haven't mentioned the war that much. I mean, obviously everyone knows it was the backdrop to things, but I think Heather's piece really kind of brings us back to earth in terms of the context of the aftermath of the First World War and things like that in her great chapter. Heather, can you unmute yourself there and join us here? And thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening, and also thank you very much to Fearghal and Patrick for setting this up. I was just so excited when I was invited to contribute to this volume, because I've been curious about a number of things to do with my work on the British monarchy in this period and the First World War, relating to Ireland. And particularly, I started to see the Irish context in terms of a polarization around monarchism and anti-monarchism. And the anti-monarchism obviously morphs very quickly into kind of crossover with Fenianism and republicanism, which have long traditions in Irish history. And this is feeding into World War I anti-monarchism that you're seeing across the continent of Europe as well. So I started getting really interested in how all of this came together. And one of the things I became very aware of was we have sort of forgotten how much monarchism was a part of the British mindset and Britishness. And we sort of sometimes in Irish history take Britain and Britishness as stable entities and take them somehow for granted, and don't maybe unpick what they meant in this period. And they meant very particular things built around monarchy. And one of the things my chapter tries to do is to kind of revisit that world and look at how important monarchism was as a kind of mindset, cultural mindset to the British, particularly around things such as the legal status of what a British subject was. It was entirely monarchist. There were, you were a subject of the monarch, emperor, and that was what made you British. So this idea of monarchism as being something that's really, really deep-seated and not just kind of some figurehead thing, a massive mentality and a cultural value for the British became very, very important, and something I was very curious about, because obviously that then clashes dramatically with the kinds of aspirations that the Irish revolutionary movement has. And that helps to explain a lot of kind of the diehard nature of some of the British positions throughout this period, because they can't let go of the monarchist element. They can't compromise on it. It's something that they need to kind of continuity to because of their own particular moral values. I was also very interested in terms of how this linked to the word dominion and this idea of a very monarchist settlement for Ireland, actually. I mean, if dominion status is a monarchist status. And so the Free State, even if it's given the name Free State, Lloyd George sleight of hand to try and make it sound like it's a South African republic, this is very much a monarchist settlement, a monarchist term and idea for Britain. And one of the things the chapter is trying to do is show how much the Anglo-Irish Treaty is an attempt by Britain to experiment with offering more autonomy to independence movements within the empire, to keep them within the empire. And so the treaty itself, it goes further than anything they've done before. For example, the concession on allowing Ireland to have its own army is huge, and that's really important. But it is an experiment that Britain is trying to use to present reformed forms of imperialism into the interwar period. And this is one of the reasons in the Civil War why the anti-treaty side gets so upset about the treaty, because to accept the treaty is to accept empire by consent. And that's the argument the British are making to their own side as part of selling this treaty. So again, that context is really, really important. And so the whole chapter is really an attempt to say, let's put the British side in a transnational global context as well. Let's open out that space, as Fearghal was saying, about the historical spaces in which we operate, and think actually about the kinds of agendas that a global Britain has in this period, and imperial Britain has in this period, in terms of sustaining its empire, reforming it, and carrying it through those challenges that the war has raised around self-determination, Wilsonian self-determination, very, very important here, around the collapse of monarchy across Europe. Remember, before the war, there's only really two model republics, France and America. Republicanism for Ireland seemed almost utopian. But after the war, republicanism is a very real aspiration. It's spread everywhere across Europe. Monarchies are collapsing wholesale all across the continent. So suddenly this looks like a very real vision, a very real political agenda, as opposed to something more idealistic and utopian from before the war. And within that context, I found it fascinating to look, you know, again, my curiosity was really sparked by these sources I was finding on the British side, where they didn't really grasp the scale to which republicanism was becoming an embedded value in Ireland in this period. There's a real time lag there. They still think this is some kind of home rule nationalism. They talk about sentimental, emotional connections to the crown, the idea that somehow the king still has some kind of moral authority in Ireland, that there's still, that the Irish are very sentimental about monarchy. Even Edward Grigg, who's a very astute observer of Ireland and who's a dove, not a hawk, is advising Lord George that actually there's still some kind of monarchism in the Irish nationalist movement quite late in the day, when there actually patently really isn't for most of those Sinn Féin voters. So I mean, it's really, there's a time lag here too on the British understanding how the global space has changed and how that's affecting Ireland. And so that's one of the things the chapter also really explores. And I suppose in terms of the findings, I mean, I think the key finding is just how much these questions around the future of Ireland were actually existentially challenging for Britain. So giving way on monarchy was to give way on the essence of what actually Britishness was. And that was very, very difficult for the British side to conceptualize. And it would, obviously a republic then therefore would mean a complete break with empire. Later on, post-World War II, with India, they come to a different conclusion. They fudge, they allow a republic to be within the Commonwealth, all the rest, and they make those steps in the other direction. But at this point, monarchism is an essential, an absolute value of Britishness. And so that is at the core of the clash around the treaty. And I think when you look at the debates of the Oath of Allegiance, those debates only start to make sense when you understand that what is at stake here is this essence of being British, which is the link to the monarchy, and breaking with that to get full independence, or being part of some kind of compromise experiment about the future of empire. Empire by consent, as it were, which is what the British see the settlement as being. And throughout, I think, really the whole period 21 to 22, and Britain's view of the Irish Civil War even, a lot of it is stemming from that fundamental issue that Britain sees this as a kind of experiment reform within empire, and the Irish side has broken with that long before. So that's really what I think the key kind of final finding of the chapter is pointing to. And obviously then the very penultimate kind of point in the chapter is about, well, what does this mean for future Irish identities? Because obviously for unionist identities, monarchism has become even more fundamental than it was before the First World War, with the sacrifices on the Somme and elsewhere being then embedded into cultural memory and mythology. To die for king and country has become a core meaning now. People have actually done it in huge numbers in the war, and so it's a very emotional talisman. Whereas for Irish nationalism, it has moved in the opposite direction. And whereas the Home Rule movement had strands that allowed for certain compromises with monarchism within them, this is certainly not the case by the time we get to 1921-22. So Irish identities themselves now polarise very radically around these kind of culture wars, really, over monarchism and anti-monarchism, effectively drawing on those debates that Fearghal mentioned that are happening across Europe as monarchies collapse elsewhere, and anti-monarchism becomes a really key understanding of modernity that is being fed back into the Irish situation.
That's wonderful, Heather. How you delivered it there is almost as good as how it is in the book, and that's a great intervention. Actually, we didn't plan it this way, but chronologically, in terms of how we're thinking of the volume now, that's really grounding. Thank you for sharing that with us, and for being in the volume. And from, I suppose, the kind of British end of things, we'll come back. I'm conscious of time. If people have questions, pop them in the chat. But we're going to go last, but by no means least, to our wonderful colleague, David Brundage. David needs very little introduction. He has written extensively on Irish diaspora nationalism and is just a great colleague, and it's so wonderful. I'm so honoured that my chapter is paired there at the end with yours. David, please join us and welcome, and tell us a little bit about your journey through this fascinating personality of W.E. Du Bois and his engagements in this area.
Sure, and thanks so much, Miriam. And yeah, maybe we can explore the parallels between our two chapters here at some point. Anyway, for me, thinking about Du Bois, the great Black activist and intellectual, I was grappling actually with a variant of the issue that Fearghal and Patrick mentioned at the outset. Though no one doubts his importance, Du Bois is often seen in strictly American terms. And of course, the American dimension of his life is critically important, whether we're talking about the founding of the NAACP or his role as a scholar of the African-American experience in books like The Souls of Black Folk or Black Reconstruction in America. But from at least 1900 on, Du Bois also operated on a global stage. And if you read The Crisis, his monthly magazine, edited from 1910 to 1935, you can easily see his ongoing and systematic attention to the larger world. Well, recent work on Du Bois has certainly been attentive to this global context, but almost no research has explored his engagement with the Irish Revolution. I think the reason for that is we've talked about this theme already here this evening, and that's the long history of Irish American racism. Why would a Black intellectual like Du Bois want anything to do with the Irish Revolution, would be one way of putting this question. And of course, Du Bois, much of his work focused on Irish American racism, his direct personal experiences with Irish American workers in New England growing up as a child. He talks about graphically in several of his essays. So, but despite this, by 1920, Du Bois was an avid supporter of the Irish Revolution. And so I took this as a kind of puzzle to be solved in my chapter. And the solution to the puzzle, I argue, was the particular character of New York City, where Du Bois lived and worked after 1910. Like London and Paris, New York became a global center of anti-colonial thought and practice between the wars. But what made New York different from those two, and again, there's a theme that's come up here this evening already, was the tremendous power of Irish revolutionary activism that you could find there. And this comes from, as Fearghal, I think, said, the ongoing role of the Irish, waves of Irish migration to the United States. So what I try to do in a pretty detailed way in the essay was to show how Du Bois was deeply connected in political ways and also in personal ways with a significant number of Irish Republicans or their supporters. And so in the course of the essay, I discussed Gertrude Kelly, Frank Walsh, Oswald Dillard, Jane Addams, the sojourning Indian nationalist Lala Lajpat Rai, and others, all of whom were in New York and in circles in which Du Bois moved. And the influence of this network of people, I argue, led him almost inexorably to embrace the Irish Revolution by 1920 and 1921. More broadly, and I think this and this where I am, but this is a theme echoed in many of the contributions to this, I think, terrific book, like we all do. It demonstrates how the Irish Revolution, I think almost as much as Wilson's rhetoric, stimulated global anti-colonial activism and thought in this immediate post-war period. So thanks, that's a kind of brief summary.
Thanks, David. I wish we had more time, because that conundrum that you talk about in terms of Du Bois and Irish American as experience of racism in certain contexts, and how you square that with then his engagement and that kind of disentangling of these personalities and individuals, or are not monolithic, right, in terms of individual relationships and networks that are being built, and you draw that out so well.
Well, I think Fearghal also got at it when he said, there are Irish people, and then there's the Irish question, and those two things really can be taken apart, I think.
Absolutely. Point well made. We're right on time. I wish we had longer, and I hope at some point, Fearghal and Patrick, you've an excuse to convene some of us in person so we can talk at more length about the fruits of this research. And it's just so interesting. I hope that people are appreciating the richness of these interventions as they've come in with us today. And thank you to everyone at Luxman Ireland House, my colleagues there, to Professor Kevin Kenny, to Caroline, to David, to Mary Elizabeth, again to the team at the NYU Press, Clara Platter in particular, and congratulations Patrick and Fearghal, and I hope that we did justice today in terms of the breadth of the volume, and thank you so much for being with us from Belfast today. And please go out and buy the book and buy it for people for Christmas and stuff like that. It's a great read. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Miriam.